Good afternoon. I'm Alfredo Fontanini, the chair of the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior. Welcome to our 23rd Mind and Brain lecture. This lecture is hosted by the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior and generously funded by the Schwartz Foundation. Let me say a few words about the Schwartz Foundation. The Schwartz Foundation was created 25 years ago to support and promote theoretical and computational neuroscience. This is a cross-disciplinary field that integrates physics, mathematics, engineering, computer science, and neuroscience with the goal of understanding the relationship between the brain and the mind. The foundation was a pioneer in supporting the birth of this field and was instrumental in establishing its success and its impact. Virtually every leader in the field of computational neuroscience has or has had a relationship with the foundation, and many major discoveries lays their roots in funding from the foundation. The brain and mind behind this foundation is Dr. Jerome Schwartz. Jerry is a physicist and an engineer. He is the co-founder of Symbol Technology. He is credited with more than 200 patents. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineers, a fellow of IEEE, a recipient of the IEEE Ernst Weber Engineering Leadership Recognition Award, and under his leadership, Symbol Technology was awarded the National Medal of Technology. Jerry Schwartz is also Emeritus Trustee of the Stony Brook Foundation. Most of all these awards, Jerry was a visionary, is a visionary, who had the brilliant intuition of the need to support the creation of a new field, theoretical and computational neuroscience. Now, investing in the intersection between physics, math, computer science, engineering, and brain science, now at these times of AI and machine learning, seems a very safe bet. Well, it was not in 1994 when Jerry created the Schwartz Foundation. The Schwartz Mind-Brain Lecture was created a few years after, in '97, to present this new perspective to the community of Stony Brook, the university, and at large. Throughout the years, it brought to Stony Brook exceptional scientists presenting their research into the most significant and challenging fields of neuroscience. This year, our distinguished speaker is Dr. Giulio Tononi, who will talk about one of the greatest mysteries of all, how the brain gives rise to consciousness. Giulio received his medical degree, he's a psychiatrist, at the University of Pisa, where he also received his PhD. Just to remind you, he's in a good company. That's the alma mater of Galileo and Enrico Fermi. Between 1990 and 2000, he was a member of the Neurosciences Institute, funded by Jerry Edelman, a Nobel laureate, first in New York and then San Diego. And then in 2000, he became a tenured faculty in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he's now David White P. Chair in Sleep of Medicine and Distinguished Chair in Consciousness Science. Dr. Tononi has published over the years almost 300 scientific articles and 4 books, and he studies the mechanisms and the function of sleep as well as consciousness. He has been interested in the study of sleep and consciousness for decades. He was telling me that he was obsessed with these problems since he was a teenager. He has made fundamental contributions to both fields. Together with his longtime collaborator, Dr. Chiara Cirelli, Dr. Tononi made groundbreaking discoveries on the neurobiology of sleep in flies, rodents, and humans. He's one of the few scientists who's capable to cross all these levels back and forth. They discovered that flies sleep much like humans. Now it's a well-known fact, but the discovery is to be credited to Giulio and Chiara. He discovered that the brain activity during sleep is actually much more nuanced and complex than we previously thought. And they discovered that after sleep deprivation, areas of the brain show some sleep-like activity even during wakefulness. Tying together all these fundamental findings and many more is the idea that the function of sleep is to readjust the synaptic connections to the neurons in a way that prevents the connections of the brain to enter into a dangerous override and overdrive mode. And this is the sleep synaptic homeostasis hypothesis. In addition to his studies on sleep and in connection to his studies of sleep, Dr. Tononi is a pioneer in the neuroscientific study of consciousness, a subject that before he started working on was the exclusive province of philosophy. He formulated a mathematical theory grounded in experimental observations that allows an exact quantification of consciousness and conscious experience. This theory has very important implications for our understanding of the brain, the mind, in both health and disease. He has received many awards, but there are just too many to list now. So tonight, without further ado and wasting too much of Giulio's time, I'll give way to his lecture, but first I want to just let you all know how pleased, this is my first brain-mind lecture, and it was particularly significant for me having Giulio as a speaker, and I'm personally very honored, and I'm sure that he'll give an excellent talk, and it will be a very fascinating talk. So without further ado, this year, 23rd speaker of the Schwartz Brain and Mind, Giulio Tononi.
Thank you, Alfredo. Thank you to Jerry Schwartz and the foundation, who has indeed enabled the study of brain and mind for many years in many laboratories in this country and elsewhere. And thank you to the wonderful audience that I see here, and I've tasted already this afternoon in the grueling afternoon routine that you pass speakers through, apparently, here, so that you have not a moment of rest, which is very important. I'm going to give a talk which I know is impossible to give. In fact, I don't give it anymore. And it was Alfredo insisting that there would not be nothing more appropriate to the Mind-Brain Foundation than a talk about the mind and the brain. And so I cannot avoid it. But I know that consciousness has to be, so to speak, swallowed whole, and it's impossible to present in one single nugget. With this excuse, I'm going to nevertheless try to compress a lot of theoretical and experimental work to give you at least a sense of where I think the study of consciousness is going, where it can go, and where potentially it may lead all of us once we understand truly what it is. And so the beginning of this lecture, you have to bear with me. I'm going to be extremely simple to try and clarify what I'm going to talk about. Everybody understands different things still under the term consciousness. So, given my title, I need to tell you what it is. And my first definition has always been, from day one, that consciousness is what goes away when one falls into dreamless sleep. I could also have said when you get into deep anesthesia, or when somebody hit you on the head. You all know what goes away. What goes away is everything. As far as every one of us is concerned, when you fall into dreamless sleep, there is nothing whatsoever. There is not you, there is not your friends, there is not the environment around you, there are no memories, there is no future, there is no present. No sounds, no sights, no thoughts, no feelings, nothing whatsoever. And so that's a rather big thing. In other words, if somebody were to give you everything, all the money, all the abilities in the world, but no consciousness, it would not be a bargain worth taking, not at all. So the definition that I like to give after what goes away, the negative definition, is that consciousness is experience, having an experience, any experience. What you see there is a drawing by the great physicist and phenomenologist Ernst Mach, sort of the view from the left eye, where he was sort of capturing the idea that everybody is sort of a prisoner of his experience. All there is seen, so to speak, from the inside, from the intrinsic perspective of the conscious experiencer. He saw his body, the bed, the room, the bookcase, the book. And that is really all there is for all of us since we wake up and until we fall asleep again. So consciousness is experience. And as the great New York philosopher Thomas Nagel put it in a way that can't be put better, it is what it is like to be. To hear a sound, to see a sight, to experience a color, a feeling, a thought. What it is like to be, and not what it is like to do. And I will come back to that from the beginning to the end. A few additional remarks. Very often consciousness is used as if it meant self-consciousness or self-reflection, the ability to think about the experience you're having. Philosophers are especially prone to that. They think so much about it that they think that all there is the thinking and not just the mere having the experience. Well, the thinking is a form of consciousness, but it's definitely not all there is to it. And so here you see, I could have put anything here, but the Chicago Board of Trade by Gursky, which gives you, or should give you, especially if the resolution were better, the sense of the extraordinary richness of the experience. You can't describe it. It's ineffable, yet it is there. You don't need to ask yourself whether you're seeing it. You're seeing it. There's nothing to do with self-reflection. You just have it, and it is extraordinary. The other thing I want to say, which is typically misunderstood, is that consciousness is not just of the environment. Now, so if you take the Hudson Valley here and you have a look, okay, well, you may be entranced by the extraordinary panorama, and of course you think that consciousness is about the stuff that's out there. The mountains, the lakes, the people, the city, everything. And of course, usually it is about that. But consciousness goes beyond that. It transcends it. And here I'm going to use something from the MoMA. This is the classic painting of Rousseau, The Dream, that reminds us that we have experiences. We see things, hear things, think things, and even feel things in our dreams when we are completely disconnected from the outside world, both on the input and the output side, yet experiences can be extremely vivid. In fact, sometimes just as vivid as in wake. And we all know that. And so our brain, of course, has been molded by the environment. But here and now, when you are asleep and dreaming, consciousness is there, whatever the environment is doing. In fact, typically not much at all. So consciousness is synonymous with experience, and it's not about the self only, it's not about the world only, it's just having an experience. And here I want to give you the key message of this approach to consciousness, that it's really about what it is like to be, it's about being, and it's not about doing. It is not just a set of behaviors or functions, including so-called cognitive functions. They usually come with consciousness, but consciousness is a state of being and not a state of doing. And so with this premise about consciousness and experience, hoping that's clear, let me come to what now is typically known as the hard problem of consciousness, the reason why it's considered to be essentially uncrackable. People don't even know how we could possibly understand how consciousness comes about and what it is. And the reason is that we know now, beyond any reasonable doubt, that consciousness has to do with the brain. Everybody knows that. You touch the brain, and if you don't do it in the right manner, something bad can happen to your consciousness. Everybody knows it. We'll see then which parts of the brain matter and which don't. But it's clear that our own experience, which is the entire universe as far as each of us is concerned, depends on this brain in our skull. But the brain, the more we study it, the more there is no reason to suspect that it is anything more than a wonderful biological machine, but still essentially a machine. Here, for those who are not neuroscientists, let's just remind you to give a sense of the complexity of the brain. Well, there are, for instance, 16 billion neurons in the cerebral cortex, which is a big number, but not that different from the number of transistors in an iPhone. There are many more neurons, 70 billions, in the cerebellum, which is a smaller part of the brain back here. which is another fantastic piece of biological machinery. Other parts, the spinal cord, just 1 billion, the brainstem, less than 1 billion. So the bulk of the neurons are in the cerebellum, and then the 16 billions in the cerebral cortex. And when you dive into the cerebral cortex, you get these columns of neurons that go from the white matter, and they form the gray matter, and all the connections among them. In fact, the connections in the cerebral cortex is something to behold. They are roughly 100 trillions. So that number remains pretty big, okay, even for fancy computers. And if you dive further in, you see an individual neuron right here with the cell body and the axon through which it communicates with other neurons. And then you can go down to the level of electron microscopy and look at the individual synapses, the connections among neurons. And they are very small, let's say 1 micron. And there are tons of them, 100 trillions, I told you, in the cortex. But then, even if you look for the molecules and the neurotransmitters, yes, it's very sophisticated, incredibly complicated, but it's still a machine. And we study it as neuroscientists like a machine. And so should we, because that's what it really is. And here, let me give you a quote about the hard problem of consciousness that was put better than by anybody else by the great philosopher and mathematician, in fact, polymath, Leibniz, roughly 300 years ago. He didn't call it a hard problem, but he had a very good analogy. He took the most complicated machines of those days, a big mill, which is a machine with ropes and pulleys. And he said to imagine to go into that machine, to enlarge it. So now imagine enlarging the brain. So the synapses are big as this ledger, and the neurons are as big as the stage, or something like that. Walk in and look at all the parts and how they interact with other parts. It's very big, it's very complicated, but Leibniz pointed out, you're not going to find anything but parts that move each other. Of course, he had no idea of electrochemical gradients and things like that, but it doesn't really change the spirit, okay? It's a big, complicated machine. And he said, we won't find anything from which we could explain a perception. The feeling of space, of time, of colors, of objects, of pain, and so on and so forth. In other words, experience. In other words, consciousness. And really, it has not been possible to move away from Leibniz's predicament ever since, because all we have there is a machine. And that's what we all study. Now, my point, and it's something I concluded very early on, is that we cannot start from matter and squeeze consciousness out of it. So there is a beautiful Vermeer exhibition, in essence, at the Metropolitan Museum, not that painting. In fact, that particular painting you will never find anywhere. But nevertheless, it gives us the sense of the astronomer, that's the title of the painting, now looking at the brain and doing the cartography of the brain and figuring out exactly how it works, and hope that maybe by looking very carefully, we would find out how you get experience out of it. In fact, even Alfredo said how the brain gives rise to consciousness, brain and mind. I think that's not the way to go. The way to go is exactly the other way around, is to start from consciousness itself, which is all we have and all we are, and move from phenomenology, from experience, to physics, rather the other way around. So this is what I will quickly try to do today. I will present what is called the integrated information theory, which is still work in progress, was developed over many years. I will call it IIT, and has this peculiarity. It starts from experience, from consciousness itself, not from behaviors, not from functions, not from neural correlates, not from the brain. It tries to say what are the essential properties of every experience. Those are called axioms. And then it translates these axioms into necessary and sufficient requirements for a physical substrate, like a brain, or for that matter, maybe it would be a computer, such that it can satisfy those essential properties of consciousness, because only if you can satisfy them could we aspire at being conscious. So let me give you a very, very quick overview of the starting point of IIT, phenomenology itself. So we're going to look for the essential properties of phenomenal existence, that is, of experience. Those that are immediately true, indubitably true, and true of every conceivable experience. And I'll just give them to you. Consciousness exists, that's obviously true. I wake up and I exist. Sounds exist, shapes exist, colors exist. But there are 5 properties that are true of every conceivable experience. One is the experience is for me, is from my own intrinsic perspective. It's not for somebody else. It's sort of private, intrinsic. The words don't really do justice to it, but it's for me. Second, it is structured. Every experience has parts and relations between these parts. They are called distinctions and relations. So in the figure of Ernst Mach that I'm using as a representative experience, but it could be the one you're having now, you always find a left side, a right side, a top, a bottom, a bed, a bookcase, a book, a blue book, all these pieces that are related with each other in various ways. Every experience is structured. And then information. Every experience is specific. It's a very funny thing. Philosophers don't even pay attention to it. They never did, actually, which is remarkable. Every experience is the way it is. You're having the particular experience you're having now, seeing me and hearing my voice with this particular color or non-color, this particular sound. And it is just the way it is, and it couldn't be otherwise. In fact, if it were otherwise, that's sort of indicated there, it would be another experience, structured differently. That's such an obvious property that nobody has remarked on it. But there must be something that makes it the way it is, and different, therefore, from trillions and trillions of possible experience. Just think about a movie. Every frame, you have a different experience. And then there are movies forever, every one of which would be a different experience. Integration. Every experience is unified. This has been remarked upon in the past, by Kant, for instance. You never experience one thing and another separately. Experience is always one. The left and the right are fused in my experience. I can talk about them, that's the structure, but they are always experienced together. So experience is unified. And finally, exclusion, which means that experience is definite, from the Latin to indicate that it has borders. So my experience and yours contains what it contains, not less and not more. If I experience the full size of this auditorium, it's the full size of this auditorium, not half of it, or a quarter of it. Not the shapes without the colors. It always contains all it contains. But also not more. My visual experience doesn't expand behind my head. So it contains what it contains, not less and not more. And once again, if you think about it, all these properties that experience exists, that it exists for me in a structured, specific, unified, and definite way, are so trivial. That's why probably people haven't remarked upon that much. But they are so trivial because they are essential, because it's inconceivable to have an experience that would lack any one of them. And in IIT, this become the starting point for going from phenomenology to physics. So we say these are the properties that are true of every experience. Can we translate them in physical terms? Where physical terms here has a very precise meaning. It has the meaning of some substrate which you can observe and manipulate, indicated there in the old-fashioned way of an eye. I look at things, and a hand. I manipulate things, like a child who is going around moving objects, trying out things all the time, as we do when we are born. But also as a scientist, all we do really is observe things with fancier and fancier tools and manipulate things. And that's what we call, in the end, the physical. Again, people normally don't think too much about it. But that's the criterion for the physical. You must be able to make a difference and take a difference, and then we say, oh, there is something there. A neuron, it can turn on and off. And so I indicate the brain. I can observe neurons, see their state change. I can manipulate them, turn them on and turn them off, which is all we do in neuroscience. So now, this slide is just to tell you then that can be developed a mathematical framework, and this is what we did over many, many years, that translates each of the essential properties of experience into physical properties. So to exist means to have cause-effect power. Take a difference, make a difference. A neuron, I can turn it on, off, it can make a difference to another neuron, and so on. Intrinsically means there must be a system that makes a difference to itself, not to something else. Composition, which is structure, means that the parts must be able to make a difference to other parts within the same system. Information, they must have specific causes and effects within that system. Integration, the system must be such that you cannot cut it, literally cut it physically, into parts without making a difference to the system. If you can cut it and it makes no difference, it's not one thing, it's two things. If you can cut it and it makes a difference, it's possibly one thing. But you have to find, which is very complicated to do, the minimum cut, the cruelest cut of all. And finally, exclusion, to be definite, there must be a substrate of the experience, which is, in IIT, it's called the maximum of cause-effect power. The physical substrate of my experience can't be, and is not going to be, my entire brain, my entire body with the entire stage, and then expand out into the universe as if it were some kind of cosmic jelly. It is clearly definite. There must be a substrate that is supporting my experience now, and it has the borders it has. So these are the 5 postulates of IIT, which are direct translations of the 5 essential properties, and they can be put in physical terms, cause-effect power, taking and making a difference, and in mathematical terms, so you can measure them precisely. So what we can do in principle, unfortunately, very much in principle right now, is to take a substrate, say the brain, with all its 100 billion neurons, or the 16 billion neurons of the cortex, or the 70 billion neurons of the cerebellum, in principle, and then apply this postulate and unfold the entire cause-effect power, all the difference that they can take and make, all the causes and effects, as long as they are unified, definite, specific, and structured. So what I illustrate there, and explain it just a little bit more later on, is the substrate at the bottom, this particular set of neurons, say, some on, some off, some in between, and the others are treated as outside. And then we unfold all its causal powers, cause-effect power to be precise, which is revealing what actually exists. All its causal powers are not just the substrate, it is this thing called the cause-effect structure. That is the one that in IIT is proposed to correspond one-to-one to experience. So you're having an experience, say this. The theory says that the experience is identical to a physical thing called a cause-effect structure, which is the unfolding of the cause-effect power of a particular substrate. It's not the substrate. The experience is not a bunch of neurons in a state. The experience is the cause-effect structure unfolded from that. Now, I know there is no way to really understand what this means without examples, without the mathematics, without a long clarification of what is meant by cause-effect power. But I told you, I was asked to give a lecture about the whole story, and so I want to give you a sense about that. And that sense, I want to illustrate now, mostly by looking at how, if you went through all the basic ideas of the theory and applied it, you could actually go and, as with any scientific theory worthy of its name, see if it has explanatory, predictive, and inferential power. So we go back to our own brain, where we know somehow consciousness must reside in some way, and check whether these principles that derive from phenomenology, they actually apply. We test the theory, but first we ask, can it explain some of the basic things we already know, but they need to be accounted for. A good theory explains, it doesn't just predict. So some of the things we know are that the cerebellum, which is this part in the back, with 70 billion neurons I showed you before, so 4 or 5 times more than the cerebral cortex, doesn't matter for consciousness. It's a fantastic machine. There's nothing wrong with it. It has more neurons, it has connections, it has neurotransmitters, it has neuromodulators, it has sensory input, motor output, it's heavily interconnected with the cortex itself. So it's as complicated as it gets. In some way, more complicated than cortex. But you take it out, and nothing whatsoever happens to your consciousness. You walk funny, sometimes you speak a bit funny, but what you see, hear, think, and feel is not changed at all. So that's something that screams for an explanation. If we cannot explain that, we understand nothing about consciousness. Now that was a guiding fact for me. We need to explain that. Or we need to explain why there are all these long, complicated loops that go through the cerebellum, through the basal ganglia, other parts of the brain, that are very important to do things like talking. So I have a vague idea what I'm going to say, but some parts of my brain take care of saying it, hopefully decently, articulating all the words, in a way that I have no idea about. I'm not at all conscious of what's going on to get the speech to flow out like this. But in the basal ganglia, for instance, and in some other parts of cortex, that somehow is happening, but it doesn't make it into my own consciousness. Or take sleep. I told you, early in sleep in particular, you lose consciousness. That was my initial definition. But we know here, this is from a cat, but it's true in humans, we showed that a long time ago, neurons are firing happily, basically at the same rate when you're awake or when you're in deep sleep and unconscious. So it's not just firing, even if the same neurons. There is something about some period of sleep that kill consciousness. And we need to explain that. It happens every night. Okay? So we need to explain that. Another interesting case are seizures. If you have a tonic-clonic seizure or an absence seizure, which are generalized seizures, which you shake like this or you stare blankly, okay, you're gone for a short time. Neurons actually fire even more than normal and even more synchronously than normal. But you're not hyper-conscious, you're gone, okay? So we need to explain that too. So these are basic facts from neurology. There's not fancy, crazy, special situations or, at the border between seeing and not seeing something. You're there or you're not there, essentially. And if we can't explain that, we don't understand consciousness. And so here, in a very modest manner, because we can't measure these things properly, rigorously for big systems yet, we set up some systems, some little models, that are organized like the cerebral cortex, or like the cerebellum, or like some of these loops that are important for speech, and we check the cause-effect structure that they support. We unfold them, we look at their powers, and then we measure if they can do a good job or not. And how much of a good job they can do is given by a quantity called phi, this Greek letter here, that can be measured, although only for small systems in a rigorous manner, and that tells you how much integrated information corresponds to the structure, which is the top row, supported by the substrate, which is the middle row, where, of course, the real substrate would be this, and the real structure would be incredibly complicated. I can't show it. So a cortex-like architecture, at least a piece like the back of the cortex, is good for phi. The structure it unfolds has a lot of cause-effect power, a unified, definite, structured, specific entity. If you take the cerebellum, even if the neurons are many, it's really modular. Turns out it's really a bunch of modules. So from the outside, it looks like one thing, the cerebellum. The substrate looks like one. It doesn't fall apart. But if you unfold its powers, we think, it breaks down into mini cause-effect structures, each of which has a minimal value of phi. So there is nothing it's like to be a cerebellum. There is something maybe minimal it's like to be a piece of cerebellum, but so little that who cares, okay? And similar things apply to these loops. From the cortex, they go down, they come back up, but when you measure phi, you see that they are excluded. Remember the axiom and postulate of exclusion? They just are connected, but the maximum of cause-effect power is not there. is within the cortex. It doesn't extend out to these loops or out into the rest of the world. So this is very short, but again, it seems to fit with some basic aspect of the anatomy. Some parts of the brain are wired correctly for having high phi and therefore high consciousness. And some, like the cerebellum, which has nothing to do with consciousness, is wired beautifully, but not for consciousness. And then some of the other work we did is, I told you, the other classic thing to explain is, why do you lose consciousness when you are in deep sleep early in the night, when you get these big slow waves in the electroencephalogram? So we took our little cortical-like system, we changed the neuromodulators, which happens when you fall asleep, and that reduces the efficacy of the interactions among the various parts of this cortical model. And as a result, it's not one thing anymore. It breaks down into pieces. It's not one single entity, it's many little entities. It fragments sort of like the cerebellum, each of which of these modules has a very low value of phi. And recently in humans, this is an intracortical recording in a patient with epilepsy. So we could record with electrodes, and we saw, without going through the pictures here, just trust me, what happens is that when the person is awake, things look like these causal interactions within this part of the cortex are fine. When he falls into, this was a man, when he falls into dreamless sleep early in the night, the neurons are firing, just like before. But there are these brief pauses when the causal interactions break down completely. And that's exactly what IIT predicts would kill the ability to be conscious. Here, something which is coming. We have been working on this for the past 5 years. The theory is not just one number, phi, to find out how much consciousness there is, although that's obviously crucial. You must be able to measure a thing in science if you actually want to make some progress. But there is the quality of consciousness. Why does space feel like space? You look at this stage, you look at the sky, you look at the blank screen, it feels extended, spatially extended. You know, words, again, are not good for something we are so used to, we take it for granted. But it feels extended, obviously. Or things feel extended in time. You never hear just one instant. You hear, people have estimated this, half a second to a second. That's how it feels. And things are stringed along in time. Why does it feel like that? With this progression in time, with things receding into the past and disappearing all the time. It's a particular obvious way in which consciousness feels. Or why do objects feel like objects? So you see a triangle, yeah, you see that particular triangle there, but you also know it is a triangle. You get the general with the particular concepts. That's a lot of our conscious experience. And of course, local qualities like colors or sounds. Why does red feel like red and blue like blue and pain like pain? All of these are fundamental properties of experience. They are not essential, meaning that they are not true of every experience. Not every experience is black or red or a triangle. But you need to account for why it feels like that. Otherwise, you don't have a theory of consciousness. And so we have started with space. Why does it feel extended? And the way it goes, I won't explain it, again, I can't, but we start with a causal model. We say, what if this were the substrate? And the substrate is a grid of neurons connected to each other with lateral connections, with nearest neighbors. A very simple thing. Then we unfold this cause-effect power, and we get something that I showed you before here. That is, in fact, a little piece of the cause-effect structure unfolded from a grid. That's the job. Now we can do it, and we can do it for very simple systems, and that is a small part, very, very small part. Once you unfold the substrate, its causal powers are extraordinary. We do them all for these simple systems. So we do this for this particular kind of substrate, and we get this cause-effect structure, and then we can show that key properties of spatial experience, that things feel extended, that a spot captures a region of space, that that region is at a particular location within the overall experience, that it has a neighborhood, a size, that there are distances between spots, like you immediately see here and here, I don't need to tell you anything. You don't need to compute anything. One is here, and they're at some distance. All of that is immediately given, but it feels that particular way. We think we can begin to account for that, not by looking at the substrate, at the grid, but by looking at the cause-effect structure as predicted by the theory. And there is a remarkable correspondence. And then if you go to the brain, funny enough, you look at this is primary visual cortex, the most studied area in the brain. And what it is, yeah, it's all kinds of things. It's very complicated, but it's a grid. You got every neuron is connected to neurons nearby. There are these patches. So it's just like a big 2D grid in which everybody talks very strongly to neurons around it and a little bit further away. That's what it is. And if you look at much of the back of the brain, it's just a bunch of grids, one on top of the other, connected among themselves in a hierarchical way. That's really the fundamental organization of the back. And that's what IIT now says is actually what's required for things to feel in space, extended, and then, hopefully, for concepts to feel the way they do. So a theory of consciousness must explain not only when there is consciousness and how much, but also what kind. And this is a first attempt, we are proceeding with other aspects, to actually account for why does it feel the way it does, the quality in addition to the quantity. So that's the other important aspect of explanation. That is a journey that's only really beginning in earnest now. Another aspect I just want to mention, it's a question that comes up all the time, is if consciousness is integrated information measured by phi and unfolded as this cause-effect structure, why did it evolve? Why would it be there in nature? So here is just to indicate work we did with simulated worlds and simulated animals, they're called, little organisms with sensors, effectors, and a little brain. And they evolve in an environment that can be simpler or more complicated, where they need to survive and change their brain. And when they survive well enough and they get very good at being adapted to that world, we check the phi value inside the brain. And we find that, on average, the more fit they are in the environment in which they evolved, the higher the phi value. And if these were real brains, they aren't, they would be more conscious, according to the theory. Still very, very little, but more conscious. In fact, for very simple tasks, which are highly modular, they may have 0 phi, and they do it just as well with little modules that do different parts of the job. But for more complex tasks that require truly integrating information, then you get integrated architectures that can pack lots of power into few units, and then, according to IIT, that will go necessarily with more and more consciousness. So it provides, in principle, a testable explanation of why consciousness evolved. Now let me go to predictions. So from the start, really, this is work, the first work of this sort started in 2003, 2004. First thing we wanted to check is if there is anything sort of not completely wrong about this theory, it should be the case that when you're very conscious, like awake, you would have a high value of phi in your brain. And when instead you lose consciousness, or mostly lose it, like in deep non-REM sleep, early in the night, that value should go down. Now, we couldn't, and we still can't really measure phi properly, but we can get some proxy, some sort of poor man's way of estimating phi. And the way we did that was to develop a way to do transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is injecting a current in a particular part of the brain through a magnetic field, in the cortex, say, in a reproducible way based on the brain of the subject, and then record with high-density electroencephalography the response to the brain. Essentially, you knock on the brain like that and see how it responds. And this is what happened. This is the old work, okay, from 2005. If you are awake, say, and we stimulate here with TMS, we see the currents that are evoked. These are the peak currents. And they tend to go around over, this is slowed down, over roughly a third of a second, half a second. They go all around your cortex for half a second. It's a very complex pattern like that. So it sort of ends now, okay? Now, if we do the exact same stimulation in exactly the same spot, but when you are in deep sleep early in the night, at a time in which if I were to wake you up, you would say that you weren't there. There was nothing there. You were unconscious. This is what happens. So you get a strong local response, just like before, because the neurons are active and reactive. It comes back right there, probably from the thalamus, and then it's gone. It doesn't really go anywhere else, and it ends very quickly. So even as a very rough measure, we see a complex response that suggests a system which is both integrated and differentiated, informative, when you are conscious, and a system that breaks down into pieces, only local, when you are unconscious, as predicted by the theory. Of course, this is very coarse, but it's a good start. Had we gotten the opposite result, it would have been a problem. And then we tried, this is more recent work, but we tried all kinds of things. Different anesthetics, here are some. Propofol, which is used regularly now. Xenon, a little bit less frequently. And you can see that compared to wake, the responses are these local responses, very stereotyped, not complex, just as predicted. And these are conditions in which you lose consciousness, because the anesthesiologist wants you to lose consciousness, obviously. But then there is a very interesting anesthetic, which is ketamine, which is used sometimes in children, often in large animals, and less so in adult humans. But nevertheless, if you use it, you obtain a perfectly good anesthesia in which you can do surgery. So you are completely anesthetized, unresponsive, you are lying on the table, no problem. But at the right dose, most subjects report, when they come out, incredibly vivid dreams. Have nothing to do with what was happening in the surgery room. Okay? Incredibly vivid dreams. So they are super conscious, if you wish, or very conscious. And we predicted that then the response would have to be complex, like in wake, or for that matter, during dreaming. And it is. You see, this is the response. During ketamine, the guy is completely out. And it looks like in wake, and it doesn't look at all like the other anesthetics. And here I was, Frodo on Mount Doom was one of the things that the person reported when she came out of anesthesia. So it doesn't matter that you are unresponsive, no inputs, no outputs. You're there, even though you can do surgery on you, okay? Now, this is important because if you do it on hundreds of subjects, which we did here, especially this is the work of Marcello Massimini, but it's in Italy, Belgium, England, and the United States in 2 or 3 different places, and it's now been done in many places. Here are all the conditions of unconsciousness: deep non-REM sleep, midazolam, xenon, propofol, anesthesia. The complexity of the response, now measured with an index, which is called perturbational complexity index, or PCI, it's just a way to put a number on it, is low. When you are awake and conscious, obviously, you see all the red dots. These are all different subjects. The value is high. When you're dreaming, either in sleep or under ketamine, is as high as when you're awake. And these are all neurological patients who, however, we know are conscious with strokes and all kinds of things, but they are conscious. And the values are high too. So we can literally draw a line with 100% sensitivity and specificity between who is conscious and who is not in us, which is the only place where we can be sure, or reasonably sure of things. So we have now an index which is based on a theory and validated in many, many different conditions of conscious and unconsciousness. And that becomes very important. Do you recognize the lady? Yeah. So this is Terry Schiavo. That was a big case, of course, in the US, because there are many patients like her where, you know, they are unresponsive. They don't talk, obviously, but they have some reactions. You can see that there. Sometimes they seem to be smirking. They seem to be perhaps even smiling. And it's very difficult for relatives not to read something into those eyes or that expression. It's natural. And some think so, the doctor thinks not, and it's very, very complicated to know. Okay? So if you just use behavior, or if you just look at neural activity, actually, it's not so good. But if, and this is a long, big study, If you actually look at this vegetative and minimally conscious patient, that's how neurologists call them, with the TMS, EEG, and this PCI measure based on the theory, what you find is that all the patients, MCS stands for minimally conscious state, which is essentially when some very good and experienced neurologists check carefully and they find that they think the patient is conscious, even if he is minimally responsive. Maybe he tracks with his eyes a little bit, that's all he does. The index is typically always high. When they are vegetative and the neurologist, a good experienced neurologist says they're not there, like Terry Schiavo, well, that's interesting. The index can be 0, down at the level of anesthesia and deep sleep, or higher at the level of wake, dreaming, ketamine anesthesia. So now we have an interesting situation here, black, blue, and green. When we do this index of consciousness, a consciousness meter, crude, but it works, we find patient in which it's 0, and I think then we can essentially tell the relatives there is really nothing there, meaning there is no person there is no experience there is nothing. And it's very important to be able to tell relatives something like that. Then we have a category where the PCI is at the level of deep sleep, but there is a response. And there is hope, in principle, to do intracortical or intracranial stimulation, for instance, to try to restore the excitability in these networks, to sort of wake them up, literally, which is something that, for instance, Nico Schiff in New York has been able to achieve in 1 or 2 patients. Is very difficult. But these, at least, we can say these are candidates for being treated with deep brain stimulation or drugs to see if we can get them out of that sort of permanent sleep-like state. And finally, there are the green subject here who have a response like you and me now, or more or less like that. These, I think, are patients who are candidates for brain-machine interfaces. They are there. They are having experiences. They just can't get it out, as if you were paralyzed or unwilling to move. There are patients like that. And so these are patients in which we should make every effort to restore some kind of communication. And there are efforts to do that in general, for instance, using fMRI, to ask patients to say yes by thinking about one thing and no thinking about another thing. And to a little extent, it can be done. But at least this way, we can measure if they are there or not and get a sense of how we should proceed with the therapy. I'm getting towards the end, and I want to give you some new data. But they are still very, very preliminary in one sense, not for the amount of work that has been 5 years, but they are an attempt to measure phi in a more direct manner based on functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, in the brain of normal subjects to see, according to the theory, there should be a maximum of integrated information of cause-effect power, and that's going to be definite with borders, and it's going to be somewhere in the brain. And so there's a lot of mathematics in trying to do a decent enough job in estimating where this maximum is. But we wanted to know, well, to the extent that these techniques can work, can we say where that border is? Where is the subset of consciousness in our own brain? We sort of know it's probably in the cortex. So we do that. And we did, this still going on, but the cerebellum here, that's low. Now this is a logarithmic scale, so the differences are gigantic, but I can't display them otherwise. So the cerebellum is very low, as I would have predicted based on the anatomy. But within cortex, if you look at the back, many of these regions organized like grids on top of grids, the value is almost 10, 15 orders of magnitude, we are not yet sure, higher than in the cerebellum and in the front. In much of the front of the cortex, somehow our estimate of phi is very low, based on cause-effect power. This has nothing to do with knowing where consciousness is. It's just the theory predicts there should be a maximum of cause-effect power of phi, and let's see where the maximum is with lots of assumptions. So take it with a lot of salt. But nevertheless, it is our attempt to find it from first principles. And then we can ask, what does the evidence say? Does the evidence fit with the theory or not? For instance, the cerebellum, I told you, it already fits. We know that you take it out, nothing to do with consciousness. But what about prefrontal cortex, which is cortex, is sophisticated, is especially developed in humans. So I'm going to show you just the result of a study we discussed actually this afternoon a bit, taking advantage of the fact that during sleep, sometimes you're there, you're dreaming, you're having experiences, and sometimes you're not. And this is the same brain in the state of sleep, but sometimes you're there, sometimes you're not. Consciousness is there, consciousness is not. Dreaming, not dreaming. So this is a good way to test what's going on in the brain and where. And we found that in non-REM sleep, which is the majority of sleep, characterized by big slow waves, when you dream, so you are conscious, there are no slow waves, or much less, in the back of the brain. That's the lateral, and this is the medial surface. This is left and this is right. So there is much less of these interruptions that cause a breakdown of information integration, but it is in the back of the brain that predicts whether you're conscious or not, whether you dream or not. This is during non-REM sleep, and a radically different kind of sleep, which is REM sleep. You can do the same contrast between dreaming and not dreaming. It's just much more frequent to dream than not, but you can do it, and the same regions show up, and the same thing that kills consciousness is the occurrence of these brief interruptions. So this evidence begins to point clearly to the back of the brain as being crucial for having experiences, in this case dreams. If you have this interruption of cause-effect power, the slow waves in the back, you're gone. If you don't, you're there. And there is a lot of literature in the past. People in New Jersey, they took out all kinds of regions of the cortex in the 40s and 50s. It's incredible to read that literature. You were assigned to this group, typically you had some mental problem. They did lobotomies, as you know, in those days, but they also took out 5 prefrontal areas on both sides perfectly well, hoping that things were getting better. They usually didn't. The guy was a bit calmer the next month or two, then he was back to what he was. But consciousness was obviously there. And so there are patients, another patient was from New York, you see him here. There was a neurologist in New York called Brickner, who studied this patient all his life, wrote a book about him. This guy was a stockbroker in New York, went unconscious because, turns out, he had a meningioma, a benign tumor in the front. The surgeon took out the entire prefrontal cortex on the left, except for the area that allows you to speak. And 2 weeks later, the other side. So when he took out the left, the guy started speaking again, became conscious again, probably because he relieved pressure. And he took out the right, and then he spent, Brickner, the next 30 years to convince the medical environment that there was something wrong with this patient. Because most of the great neurologists and psychologists at the time thought there was nothing wrong with patients with big prefrontal lesions. Well, what there was wrong was he couldn't concentrate as much, his personality had changed a bit, he had a little bit of a problem of switching between tasks, his humor was a bit funny, things like that. But conscious, he obviously was just as much as before. So you can take out a big piece of the front of your brain, and you are still conscious, almost like if you took out the cerebellum, okay? While there are basically no real good cases of that, but if you have a big lesion in the back of the brain, where those grids are and grids upon grids, then you're gone. You never come out of a coma, never, okay? So I'll end with the easiest part, in a way, very short. I want to say, if you have a theory from first principles that starts from our own consciousness, makes predictions and explanations about where it is, how much, and you validate it. Let's hope over the years it can be validated more and more. Then you can use that theory rather than your intuition or prejudices to judge difficult cases. Patients, that is from Nico Schiff again, brain islands. You have a guy who, yes, is vegetative, so possibly unconscious, but possibly not. But some regions of the brain are active almost like normal, but just some regions. What do you do with that? Is the guy not there? Is he there only experiencing sound? or they're only experiencing pain. You want to know this, and you can't without a theory. A newborn comes into the world, almost no brain activity in the cortex because the connections are not yet there, etc. Is he there? Is she there? Or not at all? And then at 1 year, the lower row, there's activity all over the place. Is he becoming conscious in the process? You need a theory to answer that. It's not enough to ask, especially when they don't talk yet. You have an octopus or any other animal you may be curious about that's sufficiently different for us, with 8 peripheral brains, 1 central brain, completely different behavior. They're intelligent, but are they conscious? You need a theory for that. And then here, I'm showing you an organoid, which are being developed very rapidly. These are brains in a dish, basically, that are cultured there. They look very much like pieces of the cortex. They are now able to even be active in a sort of normal ways. Of course, they don't have inputs and outputs, but we don't either when we are dreaming. Of course, they didn't have a history of experiences, but is there conscious or not? And you can be smug about it and say, well, they haven't really been exposed to the world, and of course they wouldn't. But you need a theory to know whether that's true or not, and then of course you need experiments. And computers. Not necessarily just an iPhone, but a sophisticated computer. That, I think, is one of the most urgent questions of our time. And here is just one slide in which we show this as a proof of principle. We have a big paper coming out now about a computer architecture that simulates a network. It would be like a network of neurons. Very, very simple still. So if you look at the substrate, this could be neurons and this could be transistors. It doesn't really matter. This is even more complicated than that because it has to implement the ALU and so on, all kinds of things. And it needs to simulate everything this does. So the whole point here is that you can achieve functional equivalence, meaning the computer simulates this little brain, and it does exactly all the things that the little brain does. Give it the same input, it produces the same output, no matter what. Absolute functional equivalence. It does all the same things. But if you measure phi, this little network, which is sort of brain-like, has some phi. It specifies a cause-effect structure. There is something there, minimal, right? But it's something there. If you unfold this substrate, although it looks much more complicated, there is nothing whatsoever. Phi is 0. So, according to the theory, you can have perfect functional equivalence. In fact, this is true for Turing-complete systems, that is, computers that are universal. It can do all the things you do, and there is no experience there whatsoever. Now, until now, we've been used to this kind of scala natura, that intelligence and consciousness go together. That if you are highly intelligent, you're probably also highly conscious. We are only intelligent when we are conscious. And when we are unconscious, we are not intelligent at all. Okay? That's clear. And we assume that animals are sort of like that. Okay? If they look intelligent, they're probably conscious. And I think in a biological system, up to a point where it becomes difficult to know, is reasonable. But as I showed you with organoids and with computers, even computers that had a body like a robot and so on, IAT says there is a complete dissociation. You can have highly intelligent machines, but if they are built like computers, running algorithms, there is zero consciousness. Or you can have something very stupid like an organoid, doesn't even have inputs and outputs, clearly is not intelligent, but it actually may be conscious if the conditions are right. So a complete double dissociation. And remember how I started. I said consciousness is not a set of behaviors or functions. It usually goes together with them in us, but it's not. It's being, not doing. But we are now reaching a point, as you know from artificial intelligence, deep neural networks, and what people are striving for, which is general artificial intelligence, has been shown in many movies and Westworld and so on. We may, sooner or later, reach a point in which machines run by algorithms may be as intelligent as we are, do all the things we do. So functional equivalent to us. And yet, according to IAT, there will be nothing there. The great physicist Erwin Schrödinger said many years ago, thinking of the universe before we showed up, that it would be sort of a sad place. Because would the world have remained without our own consciousness, a play before empty benches, not existing for anybody, and thus, properly speaking, not existing at all? Well, we have to be careful that the world that will follow us, if we are not careful, is not going to be a play before empty benches. Thank you. So I'll be happy to take some questions if we still have some time. Yeah? All right, first question, because it's right here.
So my question is, what are the inputs and outputs of a brain? You mentioned inputs and outputs in your model. What would that be?
Well, the inputs and outputs of the brain are pretty easy to point out. You've got the retina for your eyes, you've got the cochlea for the hearing, and then the more interesting question is where is still considered an input and where instead the borders of this entity that is the subject of consciousness go. And there, my personal opinion is that typically that border is at primary sensory cortices. That's for the inputs. And for the outputs, at primary motor cortices.
And how about, for example, the rest of the nervous system? Would that also be an input?
Yes, it can be.
And that would be very complicated, right?
Yeah, they can be enormously complicated, but that's not the point. The point is, where are the borders of this maximum of cause-effect power? Next.
Okay. It seems to me that in positing a one-to-one correlation between qualia and the geometry of integrated information processing systems, IIT holds that qualia are a mere epiphenomenon of information processing. If so, how does IIT propose to account for the fact that we are baffled by qualia's existence? Does this not contradict the existence of a one-way arrow of causality between the physical world and the mental world? And if you can achieve functional equivalence with no phi, why would having phi be evolutionarily beneficial?
Okay. Lots of things here, but the most important one is the misunderstanding, which is inevitable. So you say it many times, and so do essentially all people, especially in neuroscience and also in psychology and philosophy, information processing. It's as if this were a theory of information processing. It's got the name information in it, but it's absolutely not about processing. So the essential identity of IIT, of course I couldn't get into that, so you're more than amply excused, but nevertheless, is between an experience and the cause-effect structure. It's a structure. It is not a processing. It's not a function. It's nothing like that. So just forget about information processing, even if it comes natural to us as if it were spaghetti, okay? This is precisely defined. It's causal information, it's structural information, it's integrated information, all those postulates. It has nothing to do with processing. In fact, one of the most counterintuitive ideas of IIT is that you can have consciousness even if the damn thing is not processing anything at all, okay? So that's an important thing to say. And so there is no arrow of causation between the matter, the substrate, and the experience. That's not causation. Causation is horizontal, and we have the whole thing about how we measure causation. And instead, this is vertical. What exists is the cause-effect structure. The substrate is what you can manipulate. So no causation from matter to mind. Mind, meaning consciousness, is a structure, and that is matter, the substrate, properly unfolded. But this is just to throw it there without really explaining it, to emphasize it's not information processing, okay? All right, next.
Thank you. Hello. So you begin your work from the experience of being, and I'm wondering what role the experience of the self has in your experience of being, and what your work says for the nature of the self.
Not very much. So as I started at the beginning, I said experience, being, is not necessarily experience of being a self and being myself or my even autobiographical self. That is common in us. It happens to us a lot. We are self-conscious, that's what people say, but it's just an aspect of experience. So if you're lost in an action movie, you don't really think about the self, you just see the stuff happen, okay? So think of that as a paradigmatic experience. In our case, it often gets these additional connotates of being imbued with the self, and so on. Now, that's a very interesting problem in terms of neurobiology, psychology, etc. And of course, ultimately, the theory, just like it should be able to account for why does space feel extended and time flowing and concept general and particular at the same time, it should also have something to say about the geometry of the cause-effect structure that underlies feeling like a self. But we are not even remotely there. However, it's not something that is out of the scientific realm in my mind.
Can you provide some justification or some explanation of why you choose a single figure of merit that you call phi to describe these things instead of a more complex one, maybe with several variables or a vector form or who knows what?
Well, you see, thanks for the question, but one of the things I was trying to convey is precisely that phi essentially is a measure of the quantity, how much consciousness there is, and one number is enough for that if the theory is right. But what it actually is, to actually describe the quality of the experience, is this crazy cause-effect structure that I show you only partially for a minimal substrate. So actually, it's not that you need a bunch of variables. You need a gigantic form. The structure, I mean, it really does boggle the mind. I am myself surprised when we take a little system and we unfold it, if it is the right kind of system. The structure you derive, the number of their called distinctions and relations and how they are arranged that compose the structure that you would need to describe to know what it is, it just exceeds any imaginable number. So it's really awesome to consider the magnitude of the task of describing an experience. In fact, if I could spend time on this work I'm spending time on this question because it's important, okay? On this work on the quality of feeling space, extendedness, while things look here and there at some distance from each other, etc. We take it for granted. It's there. In fact, most people think space is out there, not in my mind. But of course you have space when you dream too. And once you start understanding what it takes for you to have simultaneously present, co-present in your mind, all the heres and the theres and all their distances at once, you understand that the only thing that can correspond to that is a structure of extraordinary, profusion. Okay, there.
Right. Thank you for the lecture, Dr. Tononi. So basically, I wanted to know, many Eastern philosophies contradict one of the first things you said, which was consciousness is that which leaves when there's dreamless sleep. Instead, they posit that consciousness is like a screen upon which form is projected, and when we're in dreamless sleep, consciousness is still there, it's just that the mind is off, but we remain conscious. And so we don't perceive a passage of time because there's no distinction faculty to create a passage of time. I was wondering what you have to say with regards to that.
Oh, lots of things, but not now. In other words, so what you say is certainly correct. There are some interpretations like that, but there are also in Eastern philosophies interpretations that are actually quite consistent with what I showed you. And we were talking this afternoon about one key set of experiments we are trying to do to test a highly counterintuitive prediction of IIT, which is that you might have a vivid experience in a case in which the substrate in your cortex is nearly inactive, but functional, as opposed to inactivated. And the theory predicts you would be vividly conscious, even if no neurons are firing, as long as the cause-effect power is there. But if they are inactivated, like to an anesthetic or so, then you're gone. So the theory makes a precise prediction that you could have a state of vivid consciousness with no neural activity in the right part of the brain, or a state of annihilation of consciousness if you inactivate the neurons, even though if you look at them, they're inactive in both cases. But in one case, they are inactive but capable of firing. In the other case, they are inactivated, so they are not capable. And so then it becomes almost an experimental question whether what some of the Eastern practitioners, but only a few of them actually, call pure presence or pure awareness might correspond to the state of inactivity but not inactivation. And instead, the true inactivation really annihilates consciousness, as IIT would predict. So it's a very interesting thing, but okay.
If you'll forgive me, I'll ask something a little bit irrelevant, but on the slide with the painting of the physicist in the brain, you said that painting couldn't be found anywhere?
Yes, because if you have noticed, I moved the globe of the world, which is in the original Vermeer painting, and I put the brain in there. The painting originally is called The Astronomer, and it was, about the globe.
Okay.
But the brain, in a way, as Emily Dickinson said better than anybody else, contains everything, the sky included. So I think it's very appropriate, yes.
Hello, Dr. Tononi. Thank you so much for the enriching lecture. My question is regarding physicians and aspiring physicians, because in Stony Brook University, half of the students out here are pre-meds, are trying to get inside medical school and become doctors, such as yourself. Recently, I have been following a story from a specific hospital in California, which actually had a case or a family involved whose elder, I think it was a grandfather who actually died, and the family was very, very disconcerted because the news of the patient's death was delivered by the doctor via a computer, not exactly being physically present in the room or in a counseling room as protocol would require. And given the last aspect of your lecture, which mentioned about how it's, we might actually have synapses, or we might actually be able to create a conscious being out of these inputs, outputs, and by the strength of IIT. How do you, I understand this is always a work in progress, and it's gonna take maybe another century to see its fruition. But how do you see this aspect of equivalence that we just mentioned here in terms of creating maybe a sentient being, as sentient as ourselves, who's capable of performing functions or activities as a normal physician would? How do you see that as in a position of a physician?
Yeah, so if I understand your question, you were referring to functional equivalence, as I discussed in the end, which can take, any form you like. You can take a doctor who is as good as the best doctor you can imagine, a doctor who pronounces somebody dead, as in the case you are talking about. You can take your spouse, you can take any human being that, of course, we are used to project consciousness into, just as we have it, okay, because they look and act like us. Now, from the point of view of machine learning and robotics, of course, and movies have done it before, it's actually doable, it is not an impossible task. It can only be a very difficult task, but there's no reason in principle it should be impossible to get somebody who looks like you and acts like you. And that can be done in two ways, either by straight artificial intelligence, in which you just model all the functions and the algorithm does it very efficiently, or ultimately by taking all the connections in your brain, if you could read them, and simulating them in a computer, in which case it will inevitably behave exactly like you. There is no mystery there. So faced with this, if we go by the old adaptive values we have, somebody acting like us and looking like us, of course he's going to be conscious, or she's going to be conscious. If he is a doctor, and if he's going to say, I'm conscious, you're going to believe him, and you sort of should. But if IIT is right, actually you would be completely misled. And this is the problem, because right now, most people, I want to just elaborate briefly on this, most people still think that, of course, machines are not or cannot be conscious. But the reason they think so is because they can't do this and they can't do that, or they have some notions like, well, they cannot learn. Well, they can. They won't have sense of humor. They cannot write great poetry or so. But these are all things that are going to go away. Machines are able to duplicate any function we want. Forget those romantic notions, okay? It's going to be more or less difficult to do. The romanticism is not to be found in functions, okay? But they are not going to be there at all. It's going to be totally dark and empty, so to speak, in there if IIT is right. And so, from this point of view, we have to be, I think, not glib at all in thinking that, oh, they are not conscious now because they can do X, Y, and Z, because that entails that when they actually can do X, Y, and Z, at some point we'll treat them as conscious, based on the usual criteria. But they won't be. And of course, it makes all the difference in the world if there is an experience there, what people used to call the soul, or there is just a bunch of functions. So being is not doing is something I really want to emphasize. I don't know, maybe we can take one more question, okay?
Just made the cut. I have a general question. You started out by making the contrast between going from physics to phenomenology, or your preferred route going in the other direction. So this brings to mind the obvious general question about emergent properties versus reductionism. So this could take all night, but in a few words, what is the general position of you or people in the consciousness business about to what extent is consciousness going to be a truly reductionist topic that can be taken back to physics? I loved at one point you even mentioned first principles. But this is obviously a debate about many complex properties, but since you specifically made the contrast between physics and phenomenology, that's why I'm asking the question.
Yes, and it will require a very long answer. I will say just two little things, okay? First, you can't say the consciousness field because there really isn't a field and people have all kinds of opinions, so you can't generalize at all. So I can only speak for myself, okay? And IIT actually is as anti-reductionist as it gets. So by definition, actually, is not reductionist because integration, which is measured by phi, is the extent to which something cannot be reduced to just the sum of the parts. It literally is a measure for that at every level, okay? So it's totally anti-reductionist because to be conscious, you must be maximally irreducible. That's literally what it says. It's a maximum irreducibility. And the second thing about IIT to say is that the physical is something that you sort of infer from within consciousness. So you observe things, you perturb things, all the things we do in real life, and then in a sophisticated manner in science. We are trying to get the best explanation, in fact it's called an inference to the best explanation, with respect, in the end, to what exists in our own consciousness. And that's what we have been slowly being able to do, and very powerfully, through common sense and science. But ultimately, it all starts within your own mind. And that's what really exists. And the rest is conjecture. Thank you, and have a good night.